Welcome to Rebel Speak and Be Encouraged. And today I'm reading from Joshua 5. And this is as they're about to take the land. So there's this land that's been promised to them, promised to their foreparent long ago, Abraham, his son Isaac, his son Jacob. And then there was a little 400 pause and a little 400-year-long pause in Egypt of enslavement. And then the people under a man named Moses, God works a miracle out and they are able to get out of that land, and they go through a very kind of not the quickest route, but they go kind of this southern route because they don't have to face so many enemies. And then God has a plan to move them rather quickly into the promised land, but they're not ready. They don't have confidence. So they're 40 years of transformation of them as a people, like a whole generation, the generation that says we can't do it, after God had displayed God's power, delivering them from the greatest known power on the earth. When they say, well, we can't take that land, we're not able. There's a part of God that has no patience for that lack of confidence when God's just shown them great power. And so that generation, they will be in the wilderness till those that were of fighting age no longer are upon the earth. And there's this new generation, and they are led by one of the two men that they get to go into the promised land, that are of that generation that's precluded, and that's Joshua and Caleb. And this is Joshua. Joshua is put in charge after Moses to lead the people. Moses doesn't come into the land. And they're in chapter 5, they're about to start getting ready, and they've it's not super clear, but in Numbers we know they have the Passover meal. And what's the Passover meal? Well, it's the meal that shows that the final plague that gets the king, the Pharaoh of Egypt, to let the people go is that eldest sons are killed in the land of Egypt. And Israelites put blood on their doorpost, and the angel of death passes over their home. And then they move in flight. Pharaoh says you can leave, but they've asked for some jewelry or jewels or gold. Anyway, they've got some things they take with them, but they become not fugitives, but kind of nomads in the land. And they're moving in the desert. And so there's this meal that everything you eat tells the story of God's faithfulness. Like I can think of the tears of bitterness, like where they cried bitter tears in the land, and they cry out to God, and God hears them and raises up Moses. And so there's this meal that is a kind of an active participation of their story. And they eat it in remembrance of their history, of God's faithfulness, of what their ancestors have gone through, the departure. And so they start this tradition, I know that, in Numbers. They start that tradition of the Passover. But here they are on the eve of going into or not the eve, they are about, I'm not going to say the eve because it's not the eve. Here's what I want to say. They are they're shifting from a people who've had this nomadic kind of no land people who've been following God and kind of wandering, like this trip that I think should be like 14 days or something like that. They're 40 years. And they could have all that off, but they're 40 years in this land. And now they're going to soon move into Jericho and begin the conquering of the land that God's given them. That God's prepared and God's waited. He waits on the sum of sin in the land to be at such a level that the land itself wants to spit these sinners out, and God's like, no, this land is yours. You will be righteous in it. That's God's vision for them, that they be righteous in the land. Anyway, picking up here. There's that generation destroyed, and afterwards Yahweh raised up their sons in their place, and these were the ones Joshua circumcised. So they're going to be circumcised the whole time they're wandering. They don't have this ritual of circumcision that marks them as a people in covenant with God. They were still uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. So there's a way that their lives were marked kind of by not, right, things, their customary ways of being, their customary ways of acting weren't happening. And after the whole nation had been circumcised, they remained where they were in camp until they were healed. So there's a circumcision that happens that God asked Joshua. At that time, Yahweh said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again. So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites of at Gibeath here a lot. Okay, so there's this way that their lives have looked different as they've journeyed through the wilderness. There's a way that their lives have looked like lives that are not at home. That have looked like lives that don't have any say of what happens. They're just kind of moving, and I mean, it's quite elaborate. They've got the tabernacle. They've got a lot going on. They've got a lot of the signs of who they are as a people of God, but they're not at home. There's things that aren't happening that would happen were they at home. And then Yahweh said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. So the place had been called Gilgal, which means to roll, to this day. So the place where they're circumcised is called Gilgal. And after the circumcision, God says to Joshua, I've rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. And today, in my Be Encouraged, I want to talk about places in our life that we're not quite at home. That because of situations and circumstances we've lived through. Okay, Egypt was 40 years ago. And that might seem short and it might seem long. Just depends a lot on who we are and how we see time. But because in Egypt, once upon a time, they went to Egypt really for salvation. It saved them, right? There's one of the 12 sons of Jacob, is Joseph. And Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, and then from that position, he becomes an important person that is able to feed in the time of famine folk, and his brothers show up, and he's able to feed them, and then he invites his father, his brothers, to come to live in Egypt, to be taken care of there. It's like a safe haven during a rough time of famine. But then Scripture just says there came a Pharaoh that didn't know them, and before they know it, they become an unknown people. That are in a land that's not their land. They're not at home. They're not at home, and they're taken advantage of in that place. There they become slaves. They have no power. They have no voice. They're in circumstances that are working very much against them. And when they complain, they're treated even worse, right? They have no autonomy. They have what we say, no agency. It's been denied them. And God walks into that story and sets them free. And then here at the circumcision, God says, I've rolled away the reproach of Egypt. The way that even then, after they left, they were in the wilderness, still wandering, still homeless. That there were signs of their relationship with God. There was vibrant life in the midst of this journey in the wilderness. But they weren't at home. And the things that home life was to be for them wasn't happening. And there, when they have that circumcision, I'm just going to go on. On the evening of the 14th day in the month, while camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated the Passover. The day after the Passover, that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread and roasted grain. The manna stopped. The day after they ate this food from the land, there was no longer any manna for the Israelites. But that year they ate of the produce of Canaan. Canaan. Okay. I just want to speak and encourage you that I believe there's shifts in your life and in my life where there's been an absence of some things that are just kind of dear to identity. The ways you know yourself and the ways you know who you are. And there's been kind of this odd, and you've been obedient, but it's like some of the ways, some of the things that help you know and experience yourself as you are, who you are, things important to you. They've been absent, right? So they've been living on this manna diet, and it's good food. It tastes sweet, but it's all they've had. There's not been a lot of choice, and they're transitioning into this promised land. And the reproach of Egypt, what did Egypt do? It took their identity away from them. Their identity was taken away from them in Egypt. Their identity was taken away. And there's things we go through that take away our identity and we don't know who we are. Like there's this thing where I don't know who I am. And there they are in their wilderness and they're coming to know God, but they're not living life with that autonomy, that agency that says, this is who I am, this is how I do things. No, they're responding. They're responding to the weather. They're responding to water. They're responding to the circumstances. They're not naming the circumstances. They're not in a situation. They're fine. They're fine. All right, they're fine, but they're not at home. Their personhood has been taken from them in Egypt. When that Pharaoh rose up and no longer knew who they were and decided to make them serve him. Pretty sure it's him. Make those people serve that land. And they're moving into a place where they get to eat what they want. They get to grow what they want to grow. They get to eat what they want to eat. They get to be satisfied. And that's why be encouraged that I feel that autonomy, some of us have just been in this weird season of like, I'm not sure what autonomy is. Self-rule. It's very close. That word almost could be self-naming. I, for years, thought it meant self-naming, autonomy. And I've spent a lot of time looking and to see if law and naming have some roots, historical roots, and I don't know. But I believe that when we have self-law, we are naming. Right, when we're autonomous, we get to name ourselves. And that's just, I'm holding on to that. But anyway, then the Lord said to Joshua, today I've rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. What Egypt took from you, what you lost in that fire, I'm rolling that away. I'm taking away what Egypt put on your life. What Egypt named you as, what fighting to get free of Egypt named you as, right? Fighting to get free of Egypt had him in the wilderness for a long time. Fighting to get free of Egypt, I'm taking that away. What you've had to fight to be free from what Egypt named you, I'm taking that away. I'm rolling away that reproach of Egypt from you. It's called Gilgal. It's been rolled away. Egypt's not defining you any longer. The circumstances that Egypt put you in is no longer defining you. Now I'm just going to read this again. That on the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal, where that reproach has been rolled away, on the plain of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated the Passover. All that the Passover means. Who you are, what are your roots? What do you celebrate? What do you long to celebrate? What do you long for your life? I don't mean just wealth and advantage. I mean the pieces, the vital parts. What are the things that are vital to you being you? What are those vital, like, okay, we know their shoes never wore out the whole time they're in the wilderness. They just didn't get to dress themselves. They didn't have any say in what they wore. They didn't have any say, right? God took care of them, but it wasn't a season of having say. The day after the Passover, that very day, they ate that very day. I want to get that. The day after the Passover, that remembrance of what God saved them from, the sorrow, the tears, the bitter herbs. The day after the Passover, that very day, that's scripture talking. Hear this. The day after, that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land God was giving them. They ate some of it. They had some of that first fruit reality. This land is what? It's full of milk and honey. That's an idea of delicious, good food, healthy. Wow. They ate some of that land. Some of the produce of the land. Unleavened bread and roasted grain. And then the manna stopped. The way they'd gotten through a hard, long season, they weren't going to get through life anymore in that way. The manna stopped the day after they ate the food from the land. There was no longer any manna for the Israelites. But that year, I want to say this to you in your circumstances, but that year they ate of the produce of Canaan. I want to talk about the produce of Canaan because that's a long promise. That's an Abraham promise. That's an Isaac, Rebecca promise. That's a Jacob, Leah, Rachel promise. That's a promise was, I don't know what it was doing those 400 years in Israel, what that promise was saying or not saying, or mocking or not mocking. It was a promise in the desert. It was a promise they couldn't take hold of. I'm sorry, I'm not able to take hold of that promise right now. And God said, okay, we'll get you. We'll prepare you. But they ate of that land, that long-awaited land. And I want to say to you today that there are promises in your life that God is in the midst of fulfilling. And you are going to, or you already are, eating of those first fruits. You're tasting the deliciousness of things to come. You've got through it. You've been okay. You can't complain. The manna was good. Your shoes didn't run out. Everything was okay. Your enemies that try to defeat you on that side, by the way, all had to give you greater land, right? But you didn't have much say. And you're moving in, and as you possess the land, you're going to have say. And you're growing say. And there's already been food that's a part of the promise of say in your life. Be blessed, be encouraged.